All right, Founding of the Republic, Part 3, Roman People and Religion. If you ever have a question, leave it in a comment below. Now, we've been using a lot of these Roman names, and you might be wondering, it's like, okay, this sounds kind of familiar. It's like in the modern world, most people have 3 names, so that's kind of normal. That must be just how that is. Thing is that the Romans are the ones that gave us this system of having 3 names. Most ancient peoples of this time are basically a guy or a person of a place. They don't really have these kind of familial names like we have. And even within that, the Roman system is slightly different than what we think of. It's not a first, middle, last name, but a praenomen, nomen, and cognomen. This forms the trinomina, the 3 names. Now, the praenomen is the personal name. That means that the one that if you were walking down the street, you'd say hello, and say that person's name. So, and for our most famous Roman, Gaius Julius Caesar, his personal name is Gaius. So you wouldn't, if you were walking down the street in ancient Rome and you saw Julius Caesar, you wouldn't say hey Julius or hey Caesar. You'd say hello Gaius. And so it's slightly different than maybe people are used to, especially thinking of some of these famous Roman names when we don't have all 3 names being used every single time. Now, the thing that is a little bit different than what we're used to is the idea of the nomen, which is the middle name here, which is actually the family name or the race or clan. So it's the idea of either what the main family you belong to. So this is a slightly different than how we're used to thinking about names. We usually think the last name is the one that is the family name. In the Roman sense, the last name, the cognomen, is actually sometimes an added name. Sometimes it's inherited, sometimes it's given, like we saw with Publicola, and it usually signifies a meaning that either a personal characteristic or a habit, sometimes an occupation, sometimes places of origin, or some sort of heroic exploit or thereabout that this person has been gifted with. Caesar itself literally means hairy. So it's like these types of things are basically can be descriptive. It's like, that's a hairy guy, he's Caesar, that sort of thing. While, as we saw with Publicola, it's like it was something given to him by the people, saying the people's friend. It's like he was so beloved and he did so many things to help people that he was given that name. And so sometimes we have people who already have the 3 names because they've inherited these cognomen from their family members and will do great deeds and get another cognomen added on. We'll see some heroes from the Punic Wars who will have these added names added onto them for their great exploits during the war. So this is the basic kind of idea of how the Roman naming system works. So you can see from how when things go from here, where exactly these things are coming from and what exactly they may mean. Now, I talked about the idea of Romulus dividing Roman society and when he was choosing the senators. He also divided society into 2 groups as well, or it is at least attributed to him. So there is this division in Roman society between the patricians and the plebeians. Now, in general, particularly in the early days, the patricians were the upper class, the more wealthier members of society. But because it's an inherited role, not always guaranteed to be the more wealthier members of society, as we'll see. And so in the beginning, they were the ones that particularly controlled the best lands and made up the majority of the political offices, that of the Senate and the like. And the idea that how these offices are kind of crafted for these people, and that the Senate is kind of the holding place for everyone who's ever held those offices. Now, when it comes to the plebeians, they are members of the lower class generally. Often farmers. They worked either a small parcel of land or land that is owned by patricians. At some points, they do get small plots of land for their own, but that becomes rarer and rarer throughout the centuries. Now, the thing is, though, is that, again, this is an inherited role. So that doesn't mean that someone is always poor that's a plebeian. You can have people who eventually, as commerce and the like gets built up within Rome, that become very wealthy patricians, and at the point where they could be very even more wealthy than very plebeians who are more wealthy than patricians, but still because of that sense of status are in a different class than the patricians. And we'll see how that inequality by the sense of status, because the patricians, by the sense of who they are going to have more access to different legal things and religious spheres than those of the plebeian classes. And we'll see how that breeds to conflict later. Now, how do these groups interact with one another? Since the society is divided into these two groups, how do they interact? Because as I said, it seems to lead to the idea of conflict. And that's where we get the clientia system. Basically the idea where you have a patronus, a patron, and a cliens, a client. And it's basically usually a patrician patron and a plebeian client is the idea. But not always, but most of the time. And basically the idea is that these are business-like social relationships. So the basic idea is that if a plebeian needs a job, needs to borrow money, or is a member of a family that has always been a client to a particular patron or family, they are going to be in this kind of relationship where they are going to basically go to the patron and ask for favors, ask for a job, ask for money, ask for some sort of recompense, and they will give a loyalty to that family for that kind of compensation. And these are business-like. So as much so as what we see from our example to side here, where they literally had written contracts to actually formally acknowledge these relationships. Though the thing is that where a client might only have one patron, a patron will more likely than not have many clients. And this is what allows for the building up of primarily electoral bases, because many of the patricians are going to be into the political sphere. And in order to be elected into political office, you need to have people who vote for you. And most of the time, it is your clients who are the people who, because you've given them favors, are now going to work for you. In some sense, you might be gleaming an idea that this sounds very mob boss like. It's like you've come to me at the dawn at my daughter's wedding sort of idea. It is kind of like that. It's like those kind of traditions, as we know with the Italian mob and the like, are spreading out through the ages, and it seems to be very much in some ways built off of this Roman system in many ways. So the idea of a person who is going to protect their people who are under them through legal or other means. And as we'll see later on, there are going to be instances where that becomes almost the framework of how government itself is basically built. Now, slavery. Slavery in ancient Rome is the base level of the Roman economy. The thing is that a slave is meant to be there for their master for any and all things that they could possibly want. This, of course, then means that they can be worked in a more humane type of way, or they could be worked literally to death, as we will see, particularly in mines and other cases. That, of course, means that if a slave is to be fully used, that if a slave is uncooperative, they will be beat, as we will see here in this image. We also have the idea, though, that slavery is not a permanent case, as there is many instances of slaves being freed by their masters, and these become liberti, free men. Now, the thing is that when it comes to being there for everything their masters would wish of them, that would also imply the use of their bodies. and not in just the laborious sense, but also in the amorous sense. Both male and female slaves can be used as sexual objects by their masters, and tend to be. This leads into, well, how does one become a slave? Primarily in the Roman world, people are captured in war and brought into slavery that way. There are people who are born into slavery. There is a number of different ways in which that happens. There are basically slave catchers who will, because of the fact that there is no medical way of abortion, that women who are families that do not want extra children end up leaving them on the streets, and the slave catchers will come and collect these babies to have them become slaves. We have also the idea that some individuals who are born of two sets of slaves can be brought into slavery as well. Though there is also the sense where debt can be involved in whether or not a person can become a slave. Family members, or the head of a family, can actually sell their family members into slavery to pay off debts. A person can sell themselves into slavery to pay off their debts. This is a process called nexum. So we'll get into exactly the powers of the father of the family in a moment. But as we see this breeds into a whole system where slavery and keeping people in bondage becomes vital for the Roman economy. And that's when we see objects that we see up in the top corner here, where we have a medallion that would have been worn by a slave that literally reads, "Hold me so that I do not escape, and return me to my master." And literally says who and where their master lives. And this dates to about the 4th century CE. So this is well into our Roman Empire and everything else. So this is an example of a long-standing aspect of how slavery has permeated the ancient world. Now that leads us into the idea of, well, how could a family member have the power to sell their own family into slavery? And that comes into the idea of what powers the pater familias, the head of the family, actually has. Now, we might think of this and the idea of head of household as the idea of a parent, either a father or a mother, who is in charge of their immediate family. We think of this nuclear family type option. Thing is, in the ancient world, that kind of concept doesn't really exist. Family is much more broader. It includes siblings and uncles and cousins and the like, and it becomes more clan-like, where we have multiple different, what we would consider families under the larger family branch. Now, the powers that are attributed to the pater familias, the head of household, the father of the family, is through the idea of meos maiorum, which is basically the idea of the custom of the ancestors, the ancestral custom, the way of the ancestors. And later it is codified into law, exactly what powers they do have and what powers they don't have. In the earliest periods of time, power is absolute, but eventually is kind of curtailed as the sense of absolute power is a bit much. Now, for the idea of meos maiorum, meos, which is the idea of custom, literally in plural morales, is where we get our term morals. So the idea of morals being a custom, something that has been passed down from generation to generation. And it's all this kind of underwritten social norms. Now, this comes into the idea of, well, what exactly is the powers that meos maiorum gives to the pater familias? And it's basically the power of life and death. These individuals are given over the authority that they are meant to guide their families into the future. And that not being a successful pater familias means that your family would be destroyed, destitute, cease to exist. And this is the kind of gnawing kind of idea in many of these people's heads, that they need to continuously be working to keep their family together. And so this level of power then comes into that if a member of the family is seen as working counter to the perpetual benefit of the family, the paterfamilias would be full in his right to kill that person and remove them from the family. And this comes into, well, that would not be necessarily just a father killing his son or killing his daughter or killing his wife. It could also be a grandfather killing his grandchildren, because the idea of the paterfamilias in this kind of broader family group leads into who is the paterfamilias. And it is basically the most senior member of the family. And so you might have an old man who is in his 80s, and he has several sons who are 60 years old, and each of them have children that could be in their 30s, and each of them could have then children. But that paterfamilias, that grandfather, has control of all of those people below him. And the thing is that each of those other men, even though they are fathers, they are not the paterfamilias of their own families. Their father still is, or their grandfather, or their great-grandfather. And so he has control of all that, because he is the one that's deciding the family's destiny. And so, in that case, he gets to determine, it's like, if that person lives or dies. And then this then comes into, well, how does a person become a member of the family then? You might think it's like, well, you're just born into it. The thing is there's a little bit more to it than that. Because, as I mentioned before, there are no ways to have preventative care when it comes to having babies. There's no condoms, there's no contraception, there is no abortion, there's none of those types of things. And so what ends up happening is that when a new baby is born into the family, the paterfamilias basically chooses whether or not that child is accepted into the family or abandoned. And it basically is like a ceremony where they literally place the baby at the father's feet. And if the father picks the baby up, they're accepted in the family. If the father turns away, the baby is then abandoned out onto the street to be collected as a slave. So this is the kind of very cruel nature that can be involved into the idea of Roman families, but is all the powers that are set up by tradition to basically keep the family unit strong. And the idea of being able to then perpetuate the family's position, its wealth, its status into the future perpetually forever is the idea. And if you have a weak paterfamilias, that could ruin a family completely or for generations, or be something that basically leads to many of their problems. Now, this leads into the justification for all this, and it comes down to religion. There's a lot here, and we're going to go over all of the different aspects of it. So in the kind of high kind of sense, you have, of course, your major deities. You have Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, the main three. Their Greek equivalents being that of Zeus, Hera, and Athena. Now, the thing is, though, is that this equating of gods between the Greek and the Roman is a way for each group to understand each other's gods, not as the Romans saw the Greek gods and took them as their own. The Romans had their own gods, and then the Greeks came and they said, oh, your god, that Zeus, sounds like our god Jupiter. And they equated them as the same. And then they became more cohesive as those cultures merged. So they are separate in that way. So we have our high-level gods, but then we also have our personal gods, our household gods, our lares. And our middle bottom image here is a statue of a lare. A Lars is basically a kind of fairy-like personal god that protects the family home. The altar to the side of it, you'd place these little statues and you'd make an offering to your personal house deities every day to protect your home and your family. We've already talked about the idea of the Vestal Virgins before. They also are going to be in charge of wills and the like. So when people die, they could consult the Vestal Virgins to correspond the will of that person to be able to then learn what the last wishes of that person would be. The Romans do have their own sacred texts, as we mentioned before, which are actually coming from a Sibyl, which is a prophetess that visited one of the Roman kings and basically tricked him into buying these sacred books of prophecy. And these books are basically consulted by the chief priests of Rome whenever a great calamity reaches a city, whether a plague or war or something horrible, they would consult these to try to figure out what they should do in order to please the gods to help get these things away. We also have festivals that happen throughout the year. The most famous one is the Lupercalia. Luper, meaning wolf, it corresponds to the founding myth of Rome. We see that up in our top left corner here, where it is basically a fertility festival. It happens at the same time as Valentine's Day. And basically, the way the festival works is that the men of the city, usually young men, will strip naked and tie, have a little strip of leather that they will basically go around and they will whip the young ladies of the city with this whip and to imbue them with fertility in the hopes that they will have a baby that year. So, quite unusual from our modern view for the idea of people running around naked around the city and acting in what we would consider quite a strange way. But this is part of the aspects of practicing Roman religion. Of course, we got our Pontifex Maximus, who is our highest religious figure. He's the leader over the Flamens, who are the individual priests. We have a bust of one of the Flamens here with his particular hat. Which this particular one is coming from about 250 to 260 CE. As well as we have one of the main aspects of how Romans practice their religion beyond basic sacrifice is that of augury, which is the idea of bird watching and looking for them as omens, just like we saw with the founding myth of Rome. We have a augur here, the man who actually interprets these omens in our middle image. And he's holding what is called a litis, which is basically a curved wand that is a symbol of the augurs. And basically, by taking auspices, they are basically just looking at birds and seeing what the birds do. Hence why we have in our image, we have a chicken clucking at his feet. And so chickens play a huge role in a lot of omens, and looking at how chickens act or behave will determine what the Romans do a lot of the times, especially in military campaigns. So this is a very fast and loose version of Roman religion, but it gives you the ideas of how broad a lot of Roman practices when it comes to religion are. Now, when it comes to the political kind of strains of a normal person acting in a political role, we do have official garb, so that basically the tuxedo or a suit of the ancient world, and that is what is called the toga praetexta. We have a statue of a man here wearing one. He is a man of senatorial rank. Funny enough, with many of our bronzes of the ancient world, particularly the Roman world, they're actually Etruscan bronzes. Etruria has a great cache of these where they had been buried and the like, and so they survive. As we'll see, many do not. And so this particular man, we actually know his name because his name is inscribed upon the bottom. His Etruscan name is Aule Metelle. His Latin name is Aelius Metellus. And before they knew what his name was, they dubbed the statue the orator, because that's what he's actually doing at this moment. He is raising his hand in a gesture that basically is calling out to the crowd to listen to him because he's about to speak. And it dates to about 100 BCE. So well within the Roman period, showing how the Etruscans are very much intertwined into the Roman world. So this particular statue is depicting how a member of senatorial rank would look by wearing his toga praetexta. So it is a Etrusco-Roman bronze, but it shows the idea of a person, of how they would act and dress in the act of performing rhetoric, about to give a speech. Now, that is the end of this. So if you need to look back at the previous video, it is available for you here. If you're ready for the next it up. If you had a question throughout this entire video about Roman religion or the like, leave a comment below.